It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. This week, a dramatic week in Westminster as the Prime Minister fights for his premiership.
We have more people in employment and more employees on the payroll now than there were before the pandemic began. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street.
Doesn't the country deserve so much better than this out of touch, out of control, out of ideas, and soon to be out of office Prime Minister?
And a former Cabinet Minister had his own message for Boris Johnson.
You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
That after a dramatic defection from Conservative to Labour by the MP for Bury South. The government wants new powers to deal with protests like this, but the plans were defeated in the Lords.
These amendments go far too far. We are a democratic society.
It is right that where a protest crosses the line, the police must have the necessary powers.
And in Northern Ireland, politicians paid tribute to the murdered Irish schoolteacher Aisling Murphy.
There are simply no words to convey the cruelty and the injustice of what happened to Aisling.
Too many people have lost their lives, and unless we collectively make that change and give that targeted effort, we're going to come back to this, and we shouldn't.
Well, let's start here in Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. And Susan, as we saw in the headlines, it's been another dramatic week in Parliament. And yet again, the big row in Westminster has been over those parties, events, gatherings in Downing Street. How did the events unfold this week?
Yes, well, what we've seen is the Prime Minister's political fortunes really seesawing up and down from very bad to rather better. The Prime Minister, I think, would wish it would all go away or be on the back burner at least until this senior official, Sue Gray, makes her report into it all. However, it's not been allowed to happen that way. I think Conservative MPs have been getting an earful from their constituents who did obey those rules, often at great personal cost. So they've come back to Westminster at the start of the week and the muttering started and pressure on Boris Johnson's leadership. In fact, we saw him looking pretty crestfallen at one point in the week in a TV interview. So he knew that by Prime Minister's question time in the Commons, he really had to fight back. And we did see a lot more energy from him then. However, against what a backdrop, because we had that senior Conservative, David Davis, calling for him to resign. And in those terms, really comparing the Prime Minister with the wartime Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, when, of course, Boris Johnson's big hero is actually Sir Winston Churchill. And aside from that, at the start, we had the junior Conservative MP, Christian Wakeford, the MP for Bury South, deciding to join the Labour benches. So with lashings of theatre and loads of excited cheering from opposition from Labour MPs, he dramatically crossed the floor at the start of Prime Minister's questions to sit right behind Keir Starmer and eyeballing the Prime Minister.
Can I start by warmly welcoming the Honourable Member for Bury South to his new place in the House and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. May I say, right honourable gentleman, that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It's almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it. So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I have said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe and, Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of them.
This week was supposed to be Operation Save Big Dog, but it's quickly become Operation Dog's Dinner. Absolutely pathetic. The Prime Minister, you know, what a look. The Prime Minister laughing once again, laughing at the British public. The Prime Minister is taking the public for fools. Nobody believes him. Will the Prime Minister finally take responsibility, resign? Go, Prime Minister.
I believe he is wrong in what he asserts, Mr. Speaker, but we'll have to wait and see what the inquiry says. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the most important thing from the point of view of the UK government is that we're coming out of the restrictions that we've been in. I'm delighted to see that that's happening in Scotland as well.
I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
I must say to the right honourable gentleman, I don't know what he's talking about, but what I can tell him, I don't know what quotation he's alluding to that he's referring. But what I can tell him is that I think I've told this House repeatedly throughout this pandemic, I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
Well, that was a flavour of what was a pretty feisty Prime Minister's questions. In fact, even the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, was heard to say, "What a day," afterwards. But, Susan, the drama didn't end there. In fact, a senior Conservative MP made some pretty serious allegations about the whips and the Number 10 operation.
Yes. After Prime Minister's questions, I think there was a feeling that Boris Johnson had put on a decent performance. And there was a sense that maybe because of Christian Wakeford joining Labour, that had had the opposite effect in a way and had actually helped to bring Conservative MPs together. But as I was saying, Boris Johnson's fortunes are just bouncing around at the moment because the following morning, William Bragg, a Conservative MP who has already called for the Prime Minister to resign, made a statement at the beginning of a session of the committee that he chairs, saying that the whips had been intimidating Conservative MPs. Now, some old hands would say, isn't that what the whips have always done? But it was a startling statement nonetheless.
In recent days, a number of members of Parliament have faced pressures and intimidation from members of the government because of their declared or assumed desire for a vote of confidence in the party leadership of the Prime Minister. It is, of course, the duty of the Government Whip's office to secure the government's business in the House of Commons. However, it is not their function to breach the ministerial code in threatening to withdraw investments from members of Parliament's constituencies which are funded from the public purse. Additionally, reports to me and others of members of staff at number 10 Downing Street, special advisers, government ministers and others encouraging the publication of stories in the press seeking to embarrass those who they suspect of lacking confidence in the Prime Minister is similarly unacceptable. The intimidation of a Member of Parliament is a serious matter. Moreover, the reports of which I am aware would seem to constitute blackmail.
Serious allegations have been made, and at this stage, without having had a chance to study what is said in detail, I can only offer a general guidance. While the whipping system is long established, it is, of course, a contempt to obstruct members in the discharge of their duty or to attempt to intimidate a member in their parliamentary conduct by threats.
The Speaker responding to those allegations from William Wragg. So, Susan, how serious is this?
I expect Boris Johnson would like to know that. His supporters say he can weather this storm, but his detractors say he can't. I think a lot rides on whether there are any more allegations about parties that come out over the next few days. And, of course, Sue Gray, that official, she's coming out with her report. It's meant to be next week, and a lot rides on that. We'll have to wait and see. It's not over yet.
And we will be watching closely. Now, on Wednesday, after that session of Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a statement to the House about England's Plan B measures for COVID. What was it that he said?
Yeah, this must be incredibly frustrating for the Prime Minister because the COVID figures are looking a lot better. He'd like to talk about COVID, suddenly nobody wants to talk about COVID. So the cases are going down. It suggests that his decision back before Christmas not to put in any stronger rules and regulations was possibly the right decision. And also he was announcing that the restrictions he did bring in can be lifted. So an end to face masking, an end to working from home, it's back to the office. And he was in the Commons for another hour or so on Wednesday talking about that.
We kept England open and we supported those businesses which faced reduced demand because of the response to Plan B measures. And while we must continue to remain cautious, the data are showing that time and again this government got the toughest decisions right. Yeah. Having looked at the data carefully, the Cabinet concluded that once regulations lapse, the government will no longer mandate the wearing of face masks anywhere.
The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place any longer than necessary. We will support the relaxation of Plan B as long as the science says that it is safe. So can the Prime Minister share the scientific evidence behind his decision and reassure the public that he's acting to protect their health, not just his job?
I welcome today's announcement. It won't surprise the Prime Minister, though, if I draw his attention to the fact that NHS doctors and nurses are absolutely shattered. He will have seen this week that 1 in 6 doctors say that they have had near misses or harmed patients because of exhaustion. So if he doesn't want to accept the Select Committee's recommendations to address the workforce crisis, what will he do to give hope to our brilliant frontline staff?
You would think that today of all days, opposition benches could be delighted for our great United Kingdom, delighted that legal restrictions could come to an end soon, delighted about the amazing vaccine rollout and delighted about the strength of our economy.
I was listening carefully to the Prime Minister's statement. I don't think he mentioned long COVID once. Yet, according to the ONS, over 1 million people are living with this debilitating condition. Yesterday, the all-party group on coronavirus heard heartbreaking testimony from frontline NHS workers who are living with long COVID and many of whom cannot return to work because of this condition.
That was the reaction from some MPs to that statement from the Prime Minister. Now, we will return to Westminster shortly, but for now, let's go to the Scottish Parliament, where COVID restrictions have featured as well. Our correspondent, Jenny Davison, is there. Hello, Jenny. We heard this week that most of the remaining COVID restrictions in Scotland are going to be lifted from next week. How was that received?
Generally very well. There's been quite a few changes this week. We saw restrictions on outdoor events lifted on Monday, and then on Tuesday the First Minister announced that most of the remaining restrictions would be lifted from next Monday. So that's restrictions on the size of indoor events, that's nightclubs having to stay closed, and that's things like social distancing and table service in pubs. So much of that's going to go back to normal, and the vaccine passport scheme, she also said, would not be expanded. All that generally very widely welcomed. But a couple of restrictions still in place that are a bit more controversial. One is the COVID status checking scheme, where for large events in certain venues, people either have to show proof that they're fully vaccinated or of a negative lateral flow test. The other is young people in schools having to wear face masks. Now, the Conservatives are pushing for the Scottish Government to go further and lift those too.
Most of what we've called for has been met, but the government still hasn't gone far enough in two key areas. Firstly, we welcome the move away from guidance on working from home, but can the First Minister explain the evidence behind that decision? Why at this stage can we not go further? Perhaps publish all the evidence used to make this decision. And secondly, it's right that the First Minister has backed down on extending the vaccine passport scheme. For many Scottish businesses, it remains a burden and a potential risk. The First Minister has twice threatened to extend the scheme to Scottish businesses. Twice she's backed down. Isn't it about time the First Minister accepted that this scheme is a dud and scrapped it altogether?
At every turn, whenever decisions have been taken, the Conservatives have, in my view, rather opportunistically opposed whatever it has been that the Scottish Government had recommended. That's been the case on face coverings, it has been the case on working from home, it has been the case in terms of mitigations in our schools. So with the greatest of respect, when the Conservatives have called it wrong at every key juncture in the tackling of this virus, forgive me if I continue to follow clinical advice and take careful judgments rather than follow the advice that the member is offering today.
So, as you've mentioned already, the UK government's announced an end pretty much to restrictions in England. Now, the Scottish Government tends to be a bit more careful, a bit more cautious, but we are expecting some kind of plan of the way forward shortly. So that'll show how we can expect something that's more of a return to normality.
Well, Jenny, we will definitely listen out for that. But in something else related to COVID, the Scottish Conservatives have been calling for a guarantee that exams won't be cancelled this year. What happened?
Well, that's right. There was a bit of controversy a couple of weeks ago when Education Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville tweeted about the plans for exams this year. It was suggested she shouldn't be tweeting things like that. It should be in the chamber. She pointed out that actually what she tweeted had been published way back in August and was well known already. But the big issue is around the possibility that exams could still be cancelled due to COVID, and that a final decision about that won't come until March. And bearing in mind that exams in Scotland start at the end of April. Now, the Scottish Government's saying that it's intending exams to go ahead. It has contingency in place to support pupils if things are bad, and it would really only be if public health advice was that you couldn't gather pupils together in one room for exams, that there's a small possibility they wouldn't go ahead. Now, the Conservatives are looking for something stronger than that. They want a contingency plan that doesn't involve the possibility of cancelling exams, and they want a guarantee that exams are going to go ahead.
MSPs were promised in this chamber that the SNP would learn from past experiences to ensure less disruption and stress for young people about to sit their exams during the pandemic. Yet here we are. New year, same old SNP. According to the Education Secretary, a final decision on exams could be made as late as the end of March. How can leaving young people in limbo about their examination diet be described as minimising disruption?
It is our firm intention for exams to take place, but it would be highly irresponsible to ignore the possibility, however exceptionally remote, that we hope it will be, of the pandemic worsening. Therefore, we have a robust contingency should the public health conditions make exams impossible.
A commitment has been given that exams will go ahead unless the public health advice at that time goes against that. The safety of our children is the most paramount thing. Surely the member agrees.
No, I don't agree. I think we should be told today. I think we should be told today.
Yeah, so a bit of an awkward moment there, but the main point that was being made was that it had been discussed in Education Committee that children need to know now whether exams are going ahead because it's making them anxious, all this uncertainty.
And of course, that is an issue that's of huge importance to students. Now, Jenny, one of the things that came up at First Minister's questions this week was offshore wind, with Scottish Labour questioning the awarding of some major contracts. What was that about?
Well, that's right. There was an announcement this week of 17 contracts being awarded, essentially pieces of land being awarded to different companies that they could develop for offshore wind power generation. Now that's expected to generate 700 million for the Scottish Government and around 1 billion per gigawatt. The First Minister hailed this as a truly historic opportunity that would put Scotland at the forefront of renewables generation. But at First Minister's questions this week, Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar questioned that. He said that inward investment shouldn't come at a cost to the economy or just transition or our values, and he accused the government of having sold on the cheap the right to profit from Scotland's energy transition to multinational companies with questionable human rights records. And then he also said the First Minister heard brass neck in her response to his questions.
The sad reality is that this is an SNP government that doesn't understand economic development. Scottish bridges built with Chinese steel, Scottish wind farms with turbines built in Indonesia, ferries not built with Scottish shipyards but built in Poland and Turkey, and now Scotland's seabed owned by foreign multinationals with woeful human rights records. We've heard the list of promises from the First Minister before. A state-owned energy company promised, please. Never delivered. Scotland's becoming a renewables like Saudi Arabia, promised but never delivered. 130,000 green jobs promised but never delivered. After 15 years, isn't it the case that this is an SNP government that has sold out Scottish jobs, sold off Scottish assets, and now sold out Scottish values?
Thank you, Mr Sarwar. First Minister.
I'm just sitting here reflecting, almost unbelievably actually, that Anas Sarwar has just accused me of behaving like a Tory the day after his party threw open the doors to a Tory MP. There is now so little difference between Labour and the Tories that their MPs are just interchangeable. So brass neck, I would say to Mr Sarwar, I think he'll be polishing his for the rest of the day. Look, Anas Sarwar and his many predecessors as Scottish Labour leader, I have to say I've forgotten how many predecessors as Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar has had, but they've been trotting out these negative, talk-down Scotland tropes for years. And all that has happened is that they've gone further and further and further down in the ratings in Scottish politics. They've lost more and more votes, and my party's share of the vote has increased.
Well, the First Minister also said that Scotland, the company that had awarded, or the organisation that had awarded the contracts, had processes in place for due diligence, but obviously people are now going to be watching this to see what the benefits of these contracts are.
OK, Jenny, thank you. Jenny Davison there at the Scottish Parliament. But let's return now to Susan Hume and find out what else has been happening in Westminster this week. And Susan, earlier in the week, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, confirmed that she'd asked the Ministry of Defence, specifically the Royal Navy, to get involved in this issue of migrants crossing the English Channel. But there was some criticism from MPs, wasn't there?
There was, with Conservative MPs unhappy generally following the whole party's row and the Prime Minister's position under attack. There were a couple of announcements of policies that seemed designed to cheer up Conservative MPs and appeal to them and to their voters. And one of them was this idea that the Royal Navy could help deal with the issue of migrants crossing the Channel to the UK in small boats. But you're right, it didn't quite get the reception they might have hoped, because there were a lot of MPs and Conservative ones too, suggesting that there really wasn't much substance behind that. There were a lot of difficult questions that didn't get answered about exactly what the Navy would do there and whether it really had the capacity to do it.
The government has been exploring every avenue to prevent further crossings and has now appointed Defence to take operational primacy for cross-channel counter-migration operations, which will see a much larger and more visible role for the Royal Navy. Detail of how Defence will deliver and maintain primacy of cross-channel counter-migration operations going forwards is currently being worked through. The government's objective is that nobody should arrive illegally in the UK on their own terms.
Please can the Minister explain who will pay for this mission? What does success look like? How long will the tasking last? This tactic may on the face of it look popular, with 28,000 migrants now crossing every year. Send in the Navy to sort it out. But it is not the strategy that will solve the movement of migrants.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government really is now desperate. Desperate to distract attention from accusations about the Prime Minister lying and partying in Downing Street. Desperate to prop up a Home Secretary utterly failing for 2 years as the number of cross-channel migrants has tripled. Mr. Speaker, the military are there to protect the nation, not to protect Tory ministers.
For weeks, for years, the opposition benches included have been whinging and whining we're not doing enough. I think it's excellent the military are taking control and to coordinate all the assets that we have. It makes perfect sense.
If they're not going to be involved in pushback and they're not going to deploy sonic weapons, what are they actually going to do?
In 2019, 2 Navy patrol vessels were deployed in the Channel to deal with Channel crossings, yet they intercepted no boats and it cost the taxpayer £780,000. What will be different this time?
So that announcement perhaps not getting the reception that had been hoped for. So, Susan, where does this leave the Home Secretary? Will she use the Navy now?
Well, it is a difficult issue for Priti Patel. She's under a lot of pressure from Conservative MPs to stop these migrant boat crossings in the Channel. But you heard there that the Navy can't really solve it all, and the Defence Committee is going to launch an urgent inquiry into that. And there's been pushback on some other ideas as well. For example, processing those asylum claims overseas, for example, in Ghana. Government there has said that it's not keen on the idea. So it's not an easy issue for her at all.
OK, Susan, for now, thank you very much. Now let's return to COVID-19, because that's also been a focus in the Welsh Parliament this week. Let's go to our reporter, Cemlyn Davis, who is there for us. Cemlyn, welcome. Tell us what's been happening.
Well, yes, you'll remember that last week the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, announced that the restrictions introduced across Wales on Boxing Day in response to the Omicron variant would be lifted by the end of this month, so long as the public health situation in Wales continued to improve. That process of easing restrictions is now underway, but the Welsh Conservatives have accused ministers here of having overreacted to Omicron, and they brought a debate on this on Wednesday.
Once again, the immediate reaction of this Welsh Government to the new variant was to hastily shut businesses and take away freedoms. It comes as no surprise to me that First Minister, as we have a First Minister who has spent his career theorising about socialism instead of running a business or having to worry about paying staff.
If you look at England and what they're doing, they're able to keep the economy going whilst also protecting people's lives. So we have to stop wanting to do things different just because it's seen to be better.
Nobody in Welsh Government wants to hold on to pandemic protections for any longer than they are necessary. And it is a cause for shame that the Welsh Conservatives continually suggest otherwise. Their arguments often slip into suggestions that there are some ulterior motive driving decisions in Wales, which is indicative of their drift to a paranoid, negative and increasingly irrelevant form of right-wing politics.
I am frankly disgusted with the Conservatives' attitude in this debate this afternoon. It's the most COVID-denying, the most dismissive of the realities of the losses of the past couple of years that I have ever heard. Are you ashamed that you're a party whose own leader has rubbed our faces in it through his flagrant disregard for the sacrifices all of us have had to make?
So a lively debate there, with much of the arguing focused on the different approaches taken by the UK government in England and the Welsh government here, of course. And that's a political debate that no doubt will continue for some time to come.
I suspect you're probably right, Cemlyn. Now, MSs have also been debating this week the UK government's announcement about freezing the BBC licence fee for 2 years.
Yes, this came up during Tuesday's session of First Minister's Questions, when Plaid Cymru's leader Adam Price accused the UK government of seeking to undermine democracy. And he said that this strengthens the case now for devolving broadcasting. Let's hear a bit of what he and the First Minister had to say about this.
Is the proposal to defund the BBC anything other than a politically motivated skewering designed to throw red meat to the Prime Minister's dwindling band of supporters and publish a public service broadcaster for doing too good a job of exposing Boris Johnson to be the liar that he is?
It is part of the dead meat strategy that this government has embarked upon. If anybody thinks that there is serious thinking that lies behind what has been announced, then I'm afraid they're going to be very badly disappointed.
Well, Plaid Cymru and Labour have also expressed concern over what this funding freeze could mean for the BBC's Welsh language services and the programmes that the BBC produces for the Welsh language channel S4C. Now, the UK government, as part of its announcement, also announced that S4C would receive an extra £7.5 million a year from next April via the licence fee, and that was a point made by the Welsh Conservatives here during a separate debate on this issue on Wednesday afternoon.
I wish to welcome the commitment to Welsh language broadcasting, which has been realised with the significant extra funding for S4C. Our party established the channel over 40 years ago, and we will always secure its role in Welsh life, regardless of how the BBC is funded and frivolous claims from opposition parties.
Well, S4C has welcomed that extra funding, describing it as great news for its audience.
OK, thanks, Cemlyn. Now, I think there was also an emotive debate this week about a petition opposing changes to the cervical screening programme in Wales. Tell us about that.
Yes, that's right. Since the 1st of January, the routine screening interval in Wales has been extended from 3 years to 5 for those aged between 25 to 49. Now, experts and scientists insist that this is good news and that it's the result of changes to the way the tests are carried out, with those changes now being more accurate, and so they don't need to be carried out as frequently. But the way the announcement was made raised concerns, with people worried that this would actually end up putting lives at risk. Now, Public Health Wales has apologised for failing to adequately explain why this decision had been made, and the initial announcement led to 2 separate petitions, with people calling for a rethink on this. One of those petitions has so far secured 1.25 million signatures. The other, which was launched via the Senate's website, was debated by MSs on Wednesday.
The scientific strides that have been made to make sure the test for HPV is more accurate is fantastic news, and should be celebrated. But the way in which the announcement was made was appalling and left many women feeling anxious, frustrated and confused.
This should have been a good news story, and somehow or other it's created a real sense of anxiety within our communities.
It's time for government, for officials and for the health service to not only reflect and learn lessons from the process that's happened, but also think about how it can rebuild the trust lost and to ensure that failure in this magnitude does not happen again.
Well, the Health Minister said that lessons have indeed been learned, Alex.
Cemlyn, thank you for bringing us up to date. Cemlyn Davis there in Wales. Now, let's head to Belfast and join our reporter Jim Fitzpatrick, who's at Stormont. And Jim, elected members have been told to expect to work harder over the next few months.
Yes, indeed, Alex, because Stormont was out of business due to political disagreements for 3 of the 5 years of this mandate, it has a lot of work to catch up on. And the Speaker has written to MLAs and saying that he wants to get through as much of this backlog as possible before the end of March, with an Assembly election then to follow in May. And that means they'll have extra sitting days and they'll be working longer hours. So a lot to get through in the next few weeks.
Interesting to see how that goes down, Jim. Now, members of the Assembly also reflected this week on the murder of a young woman in Ireland and the broader issue of violence against women and girls.
Yes, this was 23-year-old Aisling Murphy from Tullamore in County Offaly in the Irish Republic, a primary school teacher murdered while out for a run in her hometown, and it provoked outrage and shock across the island universally and indeed raised this issue of violence against women. This is what the Deputy First Minister Michelle O'Neill said.
Last Monday, I joined executive colleagues in asking people for their views on a new strategy to end violence against women and girls. And by Wednesday, another woman on this island had been brutally murdered. Aisling Murphy was 23. She was attacked and killed whilst out for a run. There are simply no words to convey the cruelty and the injustice of what happened to Aisling, and our hearts go out to her family and to all who loved her.
Too many people have lost their lives. And unless we collectively make that change and give that targeted effort, we're going to come back to this, and we shouldn't. So I'm committed to doing all that I can, to playing my part in addressing these issues and challenging the type of behaviour that needs to change.
What makes this murder so frightening is the casual violence in broad daylight in an area busy with people out for exercise. This could have been any woman, so it represents an attack on every woman.
A man now has been charged with the murder of Aisling Murphy.
Quite clear to see the impact that that's had, Jim. Now, there was a dramatic U-turn at Westminster this week, which has big implications for Stormont and for that looming election.
Yes, indeed. The big political story this week, the government introduced an amendment, a legislative amendment in the House of Lords that would have brought back double jobbing, allowing MPs at Westminster to sit as MLAs here at Stormont. The practice was outlawed back in 2016, and it was a surprise to many of the parties here that this seemed to be back on the agenda. It soon turned out that there was only one party here that supported it. That was the DUP. The DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, is an MP, and if he stands in the forthcoming election and becomes an MLE under current rules as an MLA, he would have to stand down at Westminster, and thereby there would be a by-election in Lagan Valley, which the DUP are not guaranteed to win. The parties who opposed it strongly, and then this was raised at Prime Minister's questions by the Northern Ireland Committee Chair, Simon Hoare.
The vast majority of people, and indeed politicians across Northern Ireland, believe that whatever the question, double jobbing is not the answer. Could I urge my right honourable friend to listen to the majority and ask him not to move the government amendment in the other place later today?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm advised that I think the amendment in question is indeed going to be withdrawn.
Well, that was news to many of the politicians and indeed to the rest of it. So it means that legislation, which appeared so suddenly, disappeared just as quickly. It's a big win for those parties that opposed it. It's a big lose and a big blow for the DUP and its leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. OK, Jim. Now, the cost of living and increases in the cost of living in particular have been making headlines right across the United Kingdom. This week, the MLAs were debating measures to help. The Communities Minister, Deirdre Hargey, was quizzed about what she's doing about a scheme to help channel money to those suffering fuel poverty. The DUP MLA, Maurice Bradley, appeared to think that not enough money was getting out there to those that need it.
It's my understanding that over 300,000 homes throughout Northern Ireland and only 300 applications per day. The frustrations experienced by people are trying to get onto the website and trying to get through by phone. Therefore, Minister, would it be apt for you to look at introducing a multi-agency task force to deal with this problem immediately and ongoing, as I think we're in for this for quite some time to come.
Well, of course, I look at the ongoing issues. I've met with a variety of organisations, and just developing a task force isn't going to deal with the immediate problem. On the one hand, we do have fuel poverty within our society, and we're looking at action plans and, of course, the housing revitalisation programme to start to address those longer-term systemic issues. But we're also in a global fuel crisis where we are at this point, and, of course, those other programmes will mitigate, but it won't overcome the issues that we're facing. So the bigger issue, I mean, the Bryson scheme was never intended. It was to target 20,000 individuals, and it was always to be additional to the £55 million scheme, which will target 280,000 individuals over the next period.
Well, with cost of living increases not expected to peak for some time yet, I suspect, Alex, this is something that we'll be talking about once again.
I suspect, Jim, you are right. But for now, thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick there at Stormont. Now, let's rejoin our correspondent Susan Hume and talk about one last story in Westminster. Susan, on Monday, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill was debated and voted on in the House of Lords. It didn't go the way that the government might have hoped. In fact, they suffered a series of defeats, didn't they?
They did. Before that debate, one peer tweeted a picture of herself holding her rolled-up sleeping bag because she was expecting the debate to go on late into the night, and it did. I was watching. I'm not sure I've recovered yet. As you can tell from that very long title that you read out of that bill, it covers a lot of ground. So they started off with issues like making misogyny a hate crime, and looking at some issues around the spiking of drinks in nightclubs and bars. And then they moved on to some very controversial changes the government would like to make around protests and demonstrations. Now, the reason for this is that the government was unhappy about some of those very long and disruptive protests from climate change protesters, such as Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain gluing themselves to motorways, you'll remember. However, some of the changes, as I say, are very controversial. A lot of peers felt it was way too heavy-handed and defeated them repeatedly through the evening, particularly, for example, on a move that would have given the police the power to stop a protest if the police felt it was too noisy.
This bill, in my view, represents the biggest threat to the right to dissent and non-violent protest in my lifetime. It's deeply reactionary. It's an authoritarian attack on the fundamental liberties of our citizens. If enacted in past generations, it would have throttled the suffragettes and blocked their ability to rattle Parliament's cage to secure votes for women.
It is reasonable for me to say that these amendments go far too far. We are a democratic society, and if I can't go outside there and make a noise to point out that I think that a whole range of things that the government or any government does are unacceptable, then my human rights are very seriously impugned.
From the government's point of view, the Home Secretary's point of view, who say they're doing it to help the police out, you're actually putting the police in a position where they're wandering around assessing noise levels, therefore choosing which demos go ahead, which everybody will think is to do with politics, not procedure, and therefore you're shooting. There seems to me to be some unintended consequences of that approach.
These measures do not stop noisy protests. Far from it, my lords. The overwhelming majority of protests will continue as now, without any conditions being attached, whether in relation to the generation of noise or otherwise. But it is right that where a protest crosses the line in terms of causing a disproportionate harm or disruption to others, the police must have the necessary powers to take effective action.
That bill proving controversial in the Lords. We will see what happens in the Commons. Susan, thank you so much for taking us through what happened this week in Westminster. That is all from our roundup of politics in the UK. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15. Until then, have a good weekend.